The year is 1997. Castlevania had proven to be a pretty successful franchise, but now it's time for the jump to a new era of consoles. Konami bet on 3D being the next big thing while giving Koji a micro budget to make a 2D one for the PS1. That Castlevania game, known as Symphony of the Night, astonishingly excelled while the 3D Castlevanias were generally poor received. Several Castlevania games on the GBA and DS would be inspired by this masterpiece. Sadly, in recent times, Konami had some creative shifts as the charitable way to go about it, and Koji Igarashi went his own separate way. One Kickstarter later, however, and a spiritual successor was born, but is it worthy to be the successor to Castlevania or just a mighty number 9 failure? This is my review of Bloodstained Original of the Night for the PC. If you've ever played Symphony of the Night, Dawn of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin, or Order of Ecclesia, you'll feel right at home here. The main difference is that it's 2.5D rather than purely 2D, but don't let that discourage you. The game is every bit as tight and smooth to control as those games ever were. Much like those, you have a random chance to absorb the power of fallen foes, this case in the form of shards. You also have a variety of weapons ranging from daggers and swords to axes and spears and even guns. Interestingly, you also get infinite bullets for the guns, although they're much weaker than the bullets that come in limited supplies. I kinda like this system as it gives the player more of a chance to experiment and determine which weapon they like the best, or at least what's best to use in a certain situation. I've switched a few times from a shovel spear to an umbrella to a sword of pure wind that cuts rapidly into your foes. Like any Metroidvania worth its salt, exploration is the name of the game here, and I especially love when you find a lever or something that opens up a two-way shortcut back into the main area. It's nice to have faster options back to an area so you don't have to keep going back the long way. Of course, you can always just teleport there via a panel of stained glass. As far as Metroidvanias are concerned, the game is technically on the easy side, but it can still pose a challenge if you aren't as experienced in the genre. Pattern recognition is the name of the game here, learning what kind of ticks the enemies will do so that you can avoid whatever attack is associated with it. Difficulty settings are locked initially until you beat the game, but if you want a true challenge out of the gate, just name yourself Nightmare. Some of the shard abilities are particularly interesting, such as one that turns you into light and bounces you off of surfaces, and one that flips the whole environment upside down in an obvious homage to Symphony's Upside Down Castle.
Now this is a story all about how my life got.
One unique thing is that you can get directional shards, that you can freely aim Miriam's hand to fire somewhat similarly to the free aim from Metroid Samus Returns. The game's enemies and bosses are likewise very unique in nature from each other, and some of them are just plain outlandish in the best possible way. If you have the Backpack DLC, you can even straight up fight Koji Igarashi himself, and let me tell you, he doesn't go down easy. Many of the main bosses were also represented in Curse of the Moon, interestingly enough, so you'll have some idea what's in store if you've ever played that one. Amusingly, there's also things like a giant cat demon and a demonic dog's head, and both of them look very photorealistic. Seems a few backers actually got their pets into the game. Some areas of progression can seem a little cryptic, but thankfully Dominique, the resident nun, can sometimes give you hints on how to proceed if you just talk to her. Naturally, as is Castlevania tradition, you can rush the game and get the bad ending, or you can take your time to look around and get the good ending. Between that and the ability to take quests for some villagers, not to mention some bonus bosses, the game has a monstrous amount of replay value for the price. Naturally, this game also contains RPG elements as with the post-Symphony era, so you can level yourself up as you fight. You can also acquire ingredients or additional shards to buff up your existing shards, and familiars will also gain EXP with you if they're summoned. As far as gameplay is concerned, Bloodstained more than lives up to the Castlevania spirit, and I think manages to improve upon it in a way that services the core of what made the post-Symphony Castlevania titles so beloved. If you like those games, or just Metroidvania in general, you should feel right at home here. The story begins with a group of alchemists finding themselves becoming less and less relevant as society's technology marches onward. Ironically, their big plan for relevancy is to invent a problem just so they can prove how necessary they are. Gotta love politics, am I right? To this end, they attempt to call upon the power of hell so that they can turn around and stop it. Surprise, surprise, this blows up in their face. During this, they've been experimenting with crystallized demonic powers known as shards. Ordinary people can't handle them, but special individuals were made into shard users with crystals that are able to absorb them. Naturally, Miriam is one of them, and Jeeble is another one. Miriam had fallen into a deep sleep and was spared the big ceremony, but Jeeble wasn't and is clearly being manipulated by demonic forces, so Miriam has to stop him. Interestingly, the game's story gets surprisingly complex as characters like Zangetsu and Elfred show up and while they're intended to stop the evil, aren't above treating Miriam as less than an ally due to her own unwitting demonic nature. I'm not going to spoil anything, but let's just say the plot truly thickens as you go along, especially if you're going for the good ending. Johannes has to be my personal favorite as far as the characters are concerned. He's a former alchemist who opposed the alchemist's final solution, as it were. As a result, he's the last surviving member and is clearly interested in atoning for his past. There's also several minor characters, such as Lindsay, aka the
Kill those murderers dead!
lady, who sends you off to kill certain types of demons to avenge villagers who were killed. You also get to meet not Dracula, aka Dracul. As a nice subversion, this alternative Dracula isn't evil, he's actually a librarian. Then you've got others, like Todd the Barber, who is cursed to be a monster unless he can craft, and get this, 666 different hairstyles.
You have the worst curse ever.
Yes, quite literally, yes.
A little on the nose there, but it works. One thing I find really amusing is that Zangetsu gets a little tsundere later on in the game, and the Jeeble interactions are actually pretty tragic.
Have my thanks.
All in all, the story is also very faithfully represented and very reminiscent of Castlevania. Miriam actually reminds me of Shinoa from Order of Ecclesia, in that she was meant to take in dark powers of sinister origin, and someone she saw as a brother ends up seemingly becoming her enemy. Again, if you like the Castlevania games, you'll have a lot to enjoy here. While Symphony of the Night and the DS Castlevania games experimented with 3D elements in the background, Bloodstained is the first to be completely in 3D. However, unlike many attempts to modernize old franchises, I'm pleased to report that the game is as vibrant and stylish as any of the old games ever were. While the beta offerings had the game looking somewhat bland, Igarashi clearly listened to fan feedback and made the game look much more lush over time. The colors really pop, and the backgrounds are loaded with detail and charm. Clearly Unreal Engine 4 was a very good choice as an engine. Miriam herself will actually have accessories affecting her appearance, allowing her look to be customized and a first for the series. And as if that wasn't enough for your fancy, you can always pay the aforementioned slasher barber Todd a visit and he'll be happy to change various aspects about Miriam's look for you. Personally, I shied away from having him change Miriam herself apart from her dress, but you're free to play around with it if you want. Not even just pleasing in an art style standpoint, the game also has some really nice technical effects, such as mirrors in the background reflecting things off of them and god rays shining through in some areas, not to mention all the foliage liberally placed throughout. The game also takes advantage of its 3D nature without compromising the 2D gameplay by allowing environments that bend around. The only other game I remember seeing such a thing in is Tarzan on the N64, and I'm surprised there aren't more 2.5D side-scrollers taking advantage of this technique. Of course, the game doesn't just look good, it sounds really good too. The exceptionally talented Michiru Yamane from the Castlevania series has returned to work on this game's soundtrack, and boy does she deliver. I know I'm probably beating a dead horse on this front, but thud thud, this is another quality of Castlevania that's in full force here. The music is as beautiful and charming as anything from the series, and there's even a really nice Easter egg if you sit down at the piano with a very familiar route.
Then the morning comes, shadowed by the moon, and the angels for whom you speak.
The voice acting probably isn't going to win any golden Emmys, but it's still quite nice for what it is. Arguably the most notable, at least for me, is that Zangetsu's voice actor is David Hayter, aka Mr. Solid Snake himself.
You catch on quickly. I have business further ahead. But I find myself at odds with the powerful witchery driving these carriages.
Given that Zangetsu is a hardened fighter with facial hair and an eye patch, it makes me wonder if Igarashi didn't intentionally make him as an homage to Solid Snake. It's worth noting because his creator, Kojima, was another developer that Konami more or less screwed over. Of course, one really nice tradition is making references to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The culprits here include a stone mask, Miriam making some very interesting poses, and there's also a character whose initials are OD, and of course backwards that says...
Dio, behold the world!
What I'm basically trying to say here is that the presentation is as wonderful as the rest of the game. Much like Metroid Samus Returns, in my humble little opinion, it manages to take a 2D game and successfully convert it into a 3D side-scroller with all the charm that went with it. Clearly, Igarashi wasn't content to just tug at our nostalgic heartstrings. He genuinely made a game that feels new from a technical level while also being reminiscent of the old charm, which is how it should be when you're bringing an old series into the modern era. Talking to you, Mighty Number 9. Kickstarter projects seem to rarely work out well, especially ones based on beloved old game franchises. Yooka-Laylee had a lukewarm reception with over-relying on old 90s mechanics, while Mighty Number 9 was just a hot mess. The pattern here painted a very grim picture for games that followed in this format, and there's plenty of horror stories to go around. Thankfully, Bloodstained can stand as a very welcome exception to that rule. From the gameplay to the story elements to the graphics to the wonderful music, it's like Castlevania was truly reinvigorated for a modern generation, and I look forward to seeing what else Igarashi has up his sleeve. Between this and the potential of Metroid Prime 4, it seems the future is truly bright right now for Metroidvania fans. I only hope Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding works out this well to send a real message that Konami needed them far more than they ever needed Konami. Thanks for watching my review, and I'll see you next time.